Hello, welcome to the nation. This week, I'm Elane, Noor, Abdullah. You're joining me here, coming to you live from Wisma Bernama in the capital city of Kuala Lumpur. And as usual, every Friday, we will discuss on local and global trending issues of the week. And this week, I'm joined by a very illustrious panel of guests. Today, I have three special guests. Bobby Varanasi, tech and business analyst, will be joining me in conversation. MARESA, a business coach, is also on the panel this week, as well as Peter NICOLL, our crisis management analyst, joining us for the nation this week. Lady, gentlemen, thank you for joining me in conversation today. Now, let's start with some topics that are trending this week. And Pete, I'm going to go to you first, as we wanted to cover the story about the Parliament special meeting, the Day One Rakyat special meeting that was convened recently, and the Prime Minister also pointed out that rescue efforts were severely hampered during the December flood emergency that hit 8 states in Peninsular Malaysia, as residents in affected areas refused to leave their homes. So you have some comments on this special meeting that was convened, Pete.
I was on earlier on at about 12 discussing this very issue. One of the key things is that the people really need to understand what emergency and disaster management is all about. And the 4 principles behind this being the mitigation, the preparedness, the response, rescue and recovery. So what we're seeing is we're seeing some steps being taken towards addressing some of the gaps that we saw that actually took place during the recent floods. But what is of concern is that we really can't allow sort of finger pointing and a blame culture to take place here. In our opinion, what's really needed here is a very strong, robust review of all of those parts, because if any of those parts of disaster mitigation fail, then the whole thing fails. So a review structure is working in individual silos, or there is a pyramid structure, or there is a mixture of both. What is the command and control structure here to be able to then put into place and mitigate, whatever the gaps are that are found, to put into place, a world-class, internationally benchmarked system for dealing with disaster and emergencies in Malaysia.
Exactly. And last week, because we've discussed this at length after the major disasters that were happening at the end of the year, we had several people come forward. We had MA Research actually come forward and said that there are lots of plans that can be put in place for us to be able to mitigate this in the future. There are case studies from a lot of successful countries that have created opportunities for us to be able to use this as a leverage point, and not just say that, it's all a reactionary, because right now we are sort of like in a reactionary mode versus being proactive about the situation. Any thoughts, MARESA? Let's go to you first.
Yeah, I think it's similar to the pandemic. I think if we're taking a look at the flood, 2 years ago we were reacting, and we had to react, and there was so much of uncertainty, and very frankly, I think it's so hard to plan these things. And I think Peter nailed it on the head as well, because I think it's these things that we have to keep simulating, and we have to keep practicing, not knowing when we are going to need to use these measures, but when it happens, it almost has to happen on the dot. So that was really good insight, Peter.
Any words?
Thanks, MARESA. That's absolutely right. Sorry, Elane. MARESA, you bang on. It's not just about reviewing, the structures and the command and control and all the rest of it, but it is actually being able to continually test the systems that you have in place to see that the mitigations actually do work, and if they don't, what do you need to address then to make sure that they continue to work properly? So that continual testing is very much part of your proper crisis management strategy.
We're definitely looking forward to better planning, because this will be coming at the end of this year as well. There's lots of work to be done before the next monsoon season arrives. But we'll quickly now jump into the other trending story that, of course, made headlines and, was taking the social media by storm, with RFID. The Works Minister had directed Plus to find a solution to the congestion issue reportedly happening at its toll plazas following the implementation of RFID. Bobby, I think you have some comments on this. Perhaps you can come in and tell us your thoughts.
Right, sure. Well, first and foremost, when you start privatizing highways, then you start giving an opportunity to those organizations to not only serve the population, which is their primary accountability, but also do it in a sustainable and a growth manner and bring in the right technologies, which a government might spend a lot longer and a lot more money. So that kind of a public-private partner combination model works very well, and we have seen it happening well. Where I think it seems to have gotten a bit derailed is that the public accountability seems to be slowly and steadily shrinking in the context of the private organizations who are participating in keeping the infrastructure up and running. And I think that's what we need to remind. So, if you think of any government organization, right, when they offer you services, they have to offer you multiple channels and multiple solutions. They cannot just say, I'm forcing you down a certain lane. A private organization can do that. But what is beautiful in a public private model, how do you balance the two? So I think what I'm seeing the Malaysian government doing is trying its best to balance the two, and we haven't gotten it right yet. But I'm sure we'll get down the road because eventually you will find that the customers, like you and I, will actually realize the max convenience of an. I've seen RFID chips 15 years back in the States, right? Nobody has anything anymore. Like you just slowly wean away from touch and goes and all this stuff.
Yeah.
But let's give it time. We cannot enforce it. That's my view.
Pete, your thoughts on this, Pete?
Yeah, Bobby's nailed it. When you want to implement something, you've got to get buy-in from the people that are going to be using that as part of your change management. So to enforce, bringing it in slowly, bringing it in a trial and test basis, getting people to buy into it, accept it, and then it becomes the norm. We'll see the public using this system, but the enforcement, you will use this, is not the right way, in our opinion.
So apparently, highway customers who experience detection issues at the RFID lanes now need not worry, as Plus Malaysia Berhad personnel will be on hand to scan their vehicle RFID tags with a handheld device. But of course, this doesn't stop social media from going abuzz, with the Rakyat expressing their disappointment and the frustration regarding this RFID implementation. There are a lot of complaints about having to pay that additional costs and unsure about the benefits. Some even question, if their smart tag, having that smart tag, would that be a wasted purchase? And what about built-in smart tags? So there's a lot of questions with regards to this. Like you guys mentioned, there's some sort of like teething problems. There needs to be some easing into this technology, and those other options in terms of all the existing touch and go as well as smart tag must still be made available, instead of sort of forcefully trying to make it happen at the same time. So now we'll jump quickly to the next story. Maresa, I think you have some stories that you'd like to highlight for this week in the nation this week. So we're talking about the shrinking of the currency. Let's perhaps you can share with us your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think it's a bane for many of the rakyat. I think I'll also speak for some of the SMEs that are having challenges with the squeezing of margins. I think a lot of people are saying that, look, cost of things are going up. I mean, it started with coffee. The cost of coffee beans were going up, and that's a staple food. Now bread is also going up, which are commodities for our diets, right? So we questioned this, in a very good article that I read a couple of days ago, was whether we were looking at whether prices were going up, the prices of raw material because of logistics and transportation, the reduced transactions, or are we looking at our ringgit shrinking? And I think it's all these forces that are coming together that is making it very hard for even SMEs to thrive. 2022, we're looking at making a recovery after being hit very hard for 2 years. Yeah. And we found that even our Thai baht is stronger than our Malaysian ringgit. So is there some power play that has to all come together, and that we also manage how much of money that we print, the corruption, all of these make a play into how our SMEs are going to be competitive. And here we talk about digitalization, and I know Bobby is going to talk about digitalization really great. I mean, and as we try and become internally more efficient and more effective as businesses, are some of these things really outside our control? I really want to hear from the rest of everybody here.
Right. Let's talk, perhaps, Bobby, since Maresa was speaking about the digital side of things. Perhaps you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, sure. The digital side, I'll come to you, but let's understand the economic side first, right?
Yeah.
A shrinking, what do you call, the reduction in value of a currency is not necessarily bad if you're an export-oriented economy,
Exporter.
which
That's right.
which if you're an exporter, you don't want your currency to be too strong. Otherwise, you're in serious trouble, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't want it to be in a moderate way. That's the reason why, if you remember, Mr. Mahathir had pegged it to 3.8, maybe some 20 odd years ago. Keep it at
Yeah.
a stable rate.
That's right.
What is not happening is, while we keep talking digital transformation of industries, we have not gotten hand in glove with value creation. We are still sitting in someone else's supply chains. We are still at the bottom end of the value pile. Now, all the SMEs, they will remain SMEs there regardless of what we do. I'm not kidding you. Right? We can keep having these discussions for another 10 years, but unless they move up the value chain through consolidations on the upstream end and the downstream end, you'll not be able to create a smarter product. You'll not be in full control of that particular supply chains, that value chain. And therefore, the cost of production is going to continue to rise because you're having to pay
Yeah.
someone else for it.
Right.
So we have very fragmented industries, and we are not at the front end of products. We are at the back end of them. So let us not belabor ourselves that throwing just digital technologies is going to transform everything. It will bring in a cost efficiency,
Sure.
but to what end? I'm still producing that same dumb stuff, right? If I start producing something smarter, then yes, the digital technologies have a multiplier effect. So we have to look at them in tandem. We are unfortunately very excited about digital conversations, but we don't talk about the economic implications. That's the sad part.
Pete, you want to weigh
Yeah, I
in on
mean,
this?
it's all really been covered there. But just to go back to really what Marissa's saying there as well, there are three real remaining risks where we are right now, that are going to drive, where our economy is going to be in the next 12 to 24 months. And that obviously is, the issue of whether there will be strong growth figures or whether there will be an impact on growth figures to be expected because of what's been happening with.
Yeah.
Yeah, we always have the temporary in between losing of
Yeah,
wheat.
what are the growth figures? I mean, year on year, fine, okay. So, but what is the growth figure? How does that impact on inflation and really hurting people's pockets? But there's also the supply chain issue. As we're coming out, or hopefully coming out of the pandemic, we're still seeing significant issues within the supply chain at a global level. So that's going to impact imports, raw materials that we need in Malaysia, as well as exports going out as well. So that, on top of a fairly low base currency, is a major threat. And the third one really is we still don't know whether there's going to be the possibility of another variant of COVID, which would be, vaccine resistant, which will put us right back to square one again. So there are, those three red flags for everything, social, political, economic, that are really still very much in the playbook as we go forward.
So this sort of casts this pall on the upcoming 2022 year with regards to what kind of outlook we're looking at, because it looks like it's extremely challenging. It's a constant struggle. Prices of materials have been hiking non-stop. Availability of these materials, people are sort of like sharks grabbing at it, and it's the supply and demand of it makes it even worse because everybody's hiking up the prices because of the scarcity of it as well. So perhaps what I want to know is, we can talk about all these as issues. How do we sort of manage and handle this? How do we navigate this oncoming? Perhaps let's start with your thoughts, Maresa, since we're starting on your topics.
Yeah. I think I go back to, there are internal and external forces. And as businesses, whether they are SMEs or multinational companies, I think the multinational companies and the listed corporations in Malaysia are doing its part to support the SMEs. and I know that they are the forefront of the supply chain, and all the SMEs do come along with having to supply this multinational companies, especially Intel, HP. You see all of this in Penang, and all the little SMEs that go along. So there are the internal and the external factors, and as much as the external factors, so much of it is uncertain. I think we as businesses need to do our part to be as efficient internally as possible, to be able to sustain or be as resilient in the next 12 to 24 months. I think it was Bobby or Pete that mentioned it earlier. We need to also start looking at exports. If we're generally an importer, how do we export to leverage and take advantage of the weak ringgit? Because that has been the savior in the last 2 years for many manufacturing companies that have been exporting. So that's why a lot of our work with Samantha, with Trade, Malaysian Trade, with SME Corp is to try and get these companies to come together and to start exporting as well. So there's one way to be able to,
Right. And also, I think picking up on what Bobby said earlier as well, which is make smarter products, get up the food chain.
Sure.
Get up the value chain instead
Value
of
add.
just sitting at the bottom and just waiting for like, oh, these are tough times. We don't have this, we don't have that. Now we need to innovate. There's a saying, adapt or die, right? So that's essentially what's happening right now. Adapt or die, and we have to move with the times. Next, I want to jump to Bobby's side with digital currency. Malaysia is assessing potential benefits of adopting a digital currency. The nation's central bank said, what's this all about, Bobby? Come, let's hear the digital currency side of things.
Well, it's a pretty interesting and a fairly complex minefield at this stage. But let's go start at the top very quickly. Is people tend to confuse that what we do today digitally is digital currency. It is not. It is just that our currency, which is issued by the central bank, is being transacted using digital technologies. All right. So the ringgits that you and I have in our touch and go cards or our credit cards, debit cards, they're standard currencies, just like the old school system when we had only notes and coins. All right. That's not digital currency. What central banks are talking about today is you have to understand the fundamentals of banking. Today, none of us have an account with the bank Nagara, right? We cannot go and open an account. Not you and I as individuals, and not any single company in this country can go and open an account. The accounts are only opened by banks. So all the country's banks have an account with the central bank, and they transact digitally. And the central bank is like the guardian, right, of the entire economy and the money. And it has these banks who will administer that money within the context of rules and regulations. The CBDCs today are talking about is the same same currency, which is our Malaysian ringgit, in a digital format, but institutions outside of banks can start opening accounts directly with the central bank. What it means is that it cuts away the hop, step, jump model of transactions and transaction fees. So, to Maresa's point, if Sime Darby is wanting to export some product, to Australia, today it will go through, let us say, its correspondent bank here is CIMB, and then CIMB talks to ANZ in Australia, and finally the buyer there. Now, through the two central banks, which is called Project Dunbar, actually, CIMB Sime Darby can straight away talk to, say, let us say, Peter is the buyer straight away. They can transact because the two central banks of the two countries are managing the interbank settlements.
So what does that mean for the banks that are being the intermediaries right now?
They will remain. What is happening is you are expanding and enriching the ecosystem, right?
Yeah.
If you have more games on the internet, it doesn't mean the number of players per game is reducing, right? So it's the same foundational principle. But what's the beauty of it is interbank transactions and settlements, which have, especially cross-border, which have huge implications when it comes to trade finance. The supply chain conversations we were having, the cost of supply chains going up, all of these will come down dramatically because of instantaneous ability to do what you call secure transactions worldwide. That's the beauty of central bank digital currency. So I'm hoping that at some point we will really get into it. I know Malaysia is signed up with Singapore, Australia, and a few other countries for international settlements, but it'll start slow. It won't go. By the time it comes to us, it'll probably be another couple of years as individuals.
Any thoughts, Maresa, Pete, on this?
Yeah, Bobby, I think we were talking about the cost of doing business, and that's going to reduce the cost of business tremendously because we're removing the middle persons. And, to Elane's point of what's going to happen to the banks for the intermediaries, they have to evolve too. Where are they going to make their monies, their financings? It's probably no longer being the middle persons, but they're going to have to come up with more innovative products. To support companies that are going digital. And we know so many companies, like I was just talking to some banks earlier, UOB has digital transformation products for SMEs, and they're heavily innovating and not being that middle person anymore. So I think this is a great transformation if it can be done. So thanks, Bobby, for sharing.
Pete, your thoughts before we go to some of your topics as well.
Yeah, I mean, excuse me. We've always been driven by the banks. The banks tell us what they can and
what they can't do. Yeah, essentially they run the system.
You can do what you can do, what we'll allow you to do and what we won't allow you to do. So there has always been those restrictions on business. What this does is it completely changes that dynamic. So that business is actually now being driven by businesses and their needs, rather than what banks allow you and allow you not to do. And that is a huge change in the dynamic of businesses and economies. And as Bobby says, I mean, everybody will win from this, but particularly businesses who will be able to adapt, change, innovate without the current restrictions that are placed on them by commercial banks and central banks.
I think that's really what it is. The topic of conversation right now, that is sort of like an overarching theme. It's like an adapt or die situation. Everybody needs to innovate. It needs to change. We cannot sit in the same place. There's no such thing as going back to what it was. It's moving forward. We need to find what's next instead of waiting for things to fall into our laps. Now, Pete, let's go to your topics. At the end, we have time for just one topic. What would you like to discuss today? You brought up some crises that you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, I think that most of us in the crisis business at the moment are very much focused on Ukraine and what is happening there with regards to Russia. This is a major event. So I think probably we need to put that particular crisis perhaps into a little bit of context to see as actually, what is going on here. The current situation is being described as extremely tense and extremely dangerous by many diplomats and crisis experts around the world. The dynamic of the confrontation really does stretch across all geopolitical demographics and could have a huge impact, not just on the combatants themselves and their allies, of course, but also nations that are sitting on the fringes of this. So the context is that what happened is that Russia is furious that the former Ukrainian president, Poroshenko, returned to President Zelensky. Poroshenko is facing claims that he was involved in the sale of large amounts of coal that helped finance Russian-backed separatism in eastern Ukraine in 2014, 2015. So he maintains his innocence and claims the successors try to discredit him to detract from the ongoing problems of the country. But more deeply...
I want to interject a little bit, Pete, because we'll probably be running out of time. But I think what I want to know is how does this impact us and how do we view this crisis?
So that's the question, is how does this affect fringe nations around the conflict, including Malaysia? So apart from the obvious economic and supply chain issues that will be affected as we move through this delicate recovery stage of the COVID pandemic, there are sanctions that have been threatened by the EU against Russia that would infuriate Moscow further. But the big one here is that if China could well be using this opportunity to assert,
Sorry, we lost
its possessions and presence in the South China Sea, And the last thing that the Western world needs right now is to be fighting on two distinctly separate fronts across the world. So what we think, Elane, is probably that the most likely scenario is a diplomatic solution if the US can back Ukraine away from its current confrontational state. But there remains at the moment a very credible threat of limited military action by Russia, and then China looking at who's supporting them. what ASEAN countries, including Malaysia, supports China if it decides to make any moves in the South China Sea. So there is a huge dynamic and a very dangerous dynamic currently taking place here.
Thank you so much, Pete. That's all the time that we have for the nation this week. I think we covered quite a number of topics today. Bobby, for the digital currency, MARESA, we're talking about the situation in terms of materials and SMEs as well. And Pete, the tense situation between Ukraine and Russia, and hopefully we'll be able to see a de-escalation of that in order for us to be able to manage already a challenging 2022 that's up ahead. So thank you so much for joining me in conversation. We were speaking to Bobby VARANASI, tech and business analyst, as well as MARESA business coach, and Peter NICOLL, for crisis management analyst for the nation this week. Thanks for staying with me till the end of the nation on this episode. Bye for now.